guest has tips for how to spot a terrorist before it's too late. Joining me right now, retired FBI agent John Iannarelli. He is the author of the soon-to-be-released How to Spot a Terrorist Before It's Too Late. Sir, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Maria.
Well, obviously, Americans are growing more and more concerned with the threat of terrorism. What are the tips to spot a terrorist?
You know, there's a number of things that the public can look for. So much information has been put out there. If you see something, say something, but nobody's really telling us what to look for. What I've tried to do, based on my law enforcement career, is look at some of the things that law enforcement just accepts in general, things that law enforcement sees, but passing that information on to the general public. For example, like today, was this individual at the German train station just wandering around the area aimlessly before the attack occurred? Things that would seem out of place that might draw your attention and you'd want to notify law enforcement about.
Yeah, and of course, the entire environment has changed, Dick Grasso. Obviously, you oversaw things getting back to normal at the New York Stock Exchange on that fateful day of September 11th. What's your take on this?
Well, I compliment John on the book and trying to make the public much more aware. But I would ask, John, if you're in the middle of a situation like the German, the horrific stabbings, what is it the public should do? I mean, beyond notifying authorities, you're in the middle of a situation where there's a person with a knife. What do you do?
Well, first and foremost, what I hope to do with the book is try to prevent these situations before they happen. But let's face it, situations are going to take place. So there's a number of things the general public needs to understand. There's no one-size-fits-all answer for everyone. It's going to depend what your abilities are, in addition to what the actual situation is. I always recommend, if you have the option to flee, that should be your first choice. If you can't flee, then perhaps you're going to hide if the situation presents itself, such as if a terrorist wanders into a building. And then finally, of course, if you have no choice, you can't depend upon the mercy of a terrorist. You're going to have to fight back. But you're not going to fight back to try to win the fight. You would fight back long enough so that you can then flee. So depending upon the person's abilities, there's a variety of things that I cover in the book of how you would handle these situations.
Mark Serrano?
John, I had the opportunity to produce some TV ads for a transit agency and Homeland Security. And in the ads, we try to convey the message to people, to commuters and others, the idea that they shouldn't have self-doubt. If they see something, they've got to take that next step. What would you suggest to a commuting public about taking the next step and overcoming that sort of natural self-doubt about what they see?
Well, we had an interesting situation the other day where a woman was on an airplane, noticed something she thought was unusual, and that she reported to the airplane personnel about taking action. Now, it turned out to be a fairly benign situation. But the reality is, worst case scenario in that situation, there was a minor delay for the flight. People need to understand that they should report what they see. Law enforcement knows how to check these things out properly. There are protocols. No one's going to be dragged off to jail needlessly. No one is going to be accused of any sort of crime. They go in, they ask questions. But by being the eyes and ears, we've seen in situations where in San Bernardino, for example, neighbors reported they thought there was unusual activity, but they were hesitant to say anything. What I'm trying to do is give some tools that people can look at and say, well, this is peculiar. Why is the person dressing this way? Why is the person hanging out and taking photographs?
Yeah.
Giving the citizens something they can report to law enforcement and say, this looks unusual, and this is why I think it is.
That's really helpful, because I think we've all experienced that situation where we've got self-doubt.
But, John, there are cultural stigmas. I mean, I think of Clock Boy, and if someone brought that kind of case into any building I would be in, I would be concerned as well and say something. But then, as a result, the teachers and people at that school were labeled as Islamophobic. So we're talking about a cultural issue as well. How do you combat that?
That's a good question.
Yep.
It's a great question. What's interesting with Clock Boy and other situations like that, I never once heard any words regarding race, ethnicity, what country they're originally from. I heard about the facts of the situation. In my book, I use the word profile, but I never once referred to it in any sense other than profiling physical activities a person is engaged in. And that's what we're focusing on. If others want to try to stretch it to claim someone's implying something other, well, then then that's their issue and that's their problem. What I want people to focus on...
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I agree what you're saying, but what we want to focus on is actions. Actions speak louder than words. It's something that we can look at, that's tangible, that we can report to the authorities. The reality is we're either going to speak up and do something, or we're going to stand by and watch what happens.
What about this issue, national security versus privacy? I mean, yesterday there were reports that Twitter is cutting off intelligence agencies from accessing a service used to identify unfolding terrorist attacks. So how will Twitter's decision impact the way intelligence agencies track terrorists? The technology industry is worried about people's privacy.
You know, there's several different issues at play here. First of all, the government was not receiving anything for free. They were paying just like any other private sector business. And my understanding is the service is still providing this information to Wall Street for purposes in managing financial markets and investments. But the overall issue is the one of what government calls going dark, that many different services that terrorists are possibly utilizing, especially on social media and through technology, is available to the terrorists. Yet these entities are not supporting government's efforts to lawfully, and I emphasize lawfully, with probable cause, search warrants, subpoenas issued by courts, etc., to be able to take a look at information. I will tell you, in my 20 years in the FBI, we've never once randomly just looked at something. There are protocols that we have to follow to be able to initiate even a preliminary investigation. Those protocols are strict. And the private sector needs to work with us and understand we are following the U.S. law. We're not violating it. We want to look at the information that's available as allowed by law only.
John, good to have you on the program this morning. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
John Iannarelli joining us there.